Rumor also had it that this conversation had been recorded. Unfortunately, neither of these rumors was true. Over a period of several weeks, the file on the Mantell incident grew in size until it was the most thoroughly investigated sighting of that time. At least the file was the thickest. About a year later, the Air Force released its official report on the incident. To use a trite term, it was a masterpiece in the art of weasel wording. It said that the UFO might have been Venus, or it could have been a balloon, maybe two balloons. It probably was Venus, except that this is doubtful because Venus was too dim to be seen in the afternoon. This jolted writers who had been following the UFO story. Only a few weeks before, the Saturday Evening Post had published a two-part story entitled, "What You Can Believe About Flying Saucers." The story had official sanction and had quoted the Venus theory as a positive solution. To clear up the situation, several writers were allowed to interview a major in the Pentagon, who was the Air Force's Pentagon expert on UFOs. The major was asked directly about the conclusion of the Mantell incident, and he flatly stated that it was Venus. The writers pointed out the official Air Force analysis. The major's answer was, "They checked again, and it was Venus." He didn't know who they were, whether they had checked, or what they had checked, but it was Venus. The writers then asked, if there was a later report they had made, why wasn't it used as a conclusion? Was it available? The answer to the last question was no, and the lid snapped back down. This interview gave the definite impression that the Air Force was unsuccessfully trying to cover up some very important information, using Venus as a front. Nothing excites a newspaper or magazine writer more than to think he has stumbled onto a big story and that someone is trying to cover it up. Many writers thought this after the interview with the major, and many still think it. You can't really blame them either. In early 1952, I got a telephone call on ATIC's direct line to the Pentagon. It was a colonel in the Director of Intelligence's office. The Office of Public Information had been getting a number of queries about all of the confusion over the Mantell incident. What was the answer? I dug out the file. In 1949, all of the original material on the incident had been microfilmed, but something had been spilled on the film. Many sections were so badly faded they were illegible. As I had to do with many, I collected what I could from the file, filling in the blanks by talking to people who had been at ATIC during the early UFO era. Many of these people were still around. Red Honecker, George Tolles, Al Dayerman, Nick Post, and many others. Most of them were civilians. The military had been transferred out by this time. Some of the press clippings in the file mentioned the Pentagon major and his concrete proof of Venus. I couldn't find this concrete proof in the file, so I asked around about the major. The major, I found, was an officer in the Pentagon who had at one time written a short intelligence summary about UFOs. He had never been stationed at ATIC, nor was he especially well versed on the UFO problem. When the word of the press conference regarding the Mantell incident came down, a UFO expert was needed. The major, because of his short intelligence summary on UFOs, became the expert. He had evidently conjured up they and their later report to support his Venus answer because the writers at the press conference had him in a corner. I looked farther. Fortunately, the man who had done the most extensive work on the incident, Dr. J. Allen Hynek, head of the Ohio State University Astronomy Department, could be contacted. I called Dr. Hynek and arranged to meet him the next day. Dr. Hynek was one of the most impressive scientists I met while working on the UFO project, and I met a good many. He didn't do two things that some of them did: give you the answer before he knew the question, or immediately begin to expound on his accomplishments in the field of science. I arrived at Ohio State just before lunch, and Dr. Hynek invited me to eat with him at the faculty club. He wanted to refer to some notes he had on the Mantell incident, and they were in his office, so we discussed UFOs in general during lunch. Back in his office, he started to review the Mantell incident. He had been responsible for the weasel-worded report that the Air Force released in late 1949, and he apologized for it. Had he known that it was going to cause so much confusion, he said, he would have been more specific. He thought the incident was a dead issue. The reason that Venus had been such a strong suspect was that it was in almost the same spot in the sky as the UFO. Dr. Hynek referred to his notes and told me that at 3:00 p.m., Venus had been south-southwest of Godman and 33 degrees above the southern horizon. At 3:00 p.m., the people in the tower estimated the UFO to be southwest of Godman and at an elevation of about 45 degrees. Allowing for human error in estimating directions and angles, this was close. I agreed. There was one big flaw in the theory, however. Venus wasn't bright enough to be seen. He had computed the brilliance of the planet, and on the day in question, it was only 6 times as bright as the surrounding sky. Then he explained what this meant. 6 times may sound like a lot, but it isn't. When you start looking for a pinpoint of light only 6 times as bright as the surrounding sky, it's almost impossible to find it, even on a clear day. Dr. Hynek said that he didn't think that the UFO was Venus. I later found out that although it was a relatively clear day, there was considerable haze. I asked him about some of the other possibilities. He repeated the balloon, canopy reflection, and sundog theories, but he refused to comment on them since, as he said, he was an astrophysicist and would care to comment only on the astrophysical aspects of the sightings. I drove back to Dayton convinced that the UFO wasn't Venus. Dr. Hynek had said Venus would have been a pinpoint of light. The people in the tower had been positive of their descriptions. Their statements brought that out. They couldn't agree on a description. They called the UFO a parachute, an ice cream cone tipped with red, round and white, huge and silver or metallic, a small white object, 1/4 the size of the full moon, but all the descriptions plainly indicated a large object. None of the descriptions could even vaguely be called a pinpoint of light. This aspect of a definite shape seemed to eliminate the sundog theory too. Sundogs, or parhelia, as they are technically known, are caused by ice particles reflecting a diffused light. This would not give a sharp outline. I also recalled 2 instances where Air Force pilots had chased sundogs. In both instances, when the aircraft began to climb, the sundog disappeared. This was because the angle of reflection changed as the airplane climbed several thousand feet. These sundog-caused UFOs also had fuzzy edges. I had always heard a lot of wild speculation about the condition of Mantell's crashed F-51, so I wired for a copy of the accident report. It arrived several days after my visit with Dr. Hynek. The report said that the F-51 had lost a wing due to excessive speed in a dive after Mantell had blacked out due to the lack of oxygen. Mantell's body had not burned, nor disintegrated, and was not full of holes. The wreck was not radioactive, nor was it magnetized. One very important and pertinent question remained. Why did Mantell, an experienced pilot, when he didn't even have an oxygen mask? If he had run out of oxygen, it would have been different. Every pilot and crewman has it pounded into him, do not, under any circumstances, go above 15,000 feet without oxygen. In high-altitude indoctrination during World War II, I made several trips up to 30,000 feet in a pressure chamber. To demonstrate anoxia, we would leave our oxygen masks off until we became dizzy. A few of the more hardy souls could get to 15,000 feet, but nobody ever got over 17,000. Possibly, Mantell thought he could climb up to 20,000 in a hurry and get back down before he got anoxia and blacked out. But this would be a foolish chance. This point was covered in the sighting report. A longtime friend of Mantell's went on record as saying that he'd flown with him several years and knew him personally. He couldn't conceive of Mantell's ever thinking about disregarding his lack of oxygen. Mantell was one of the most cautious pilots he knew. "The only thing I can think," he commented, "was that he was after something that he believed to be more important than his life or his family." My next step was to try and find out what Mantell's wingmen had seen or thought, but this was a blind alley. All of this evidence was in the ruined portion of the microfilm. Even their names were missing. The only reference I could find to them was a vague passage indicating they hadn't seen anything. I concentrated on the canopy reflection theory. It is widely believed that many flying saucers appear to pilots who are actually chasing a reflection on their canopy. I checked over all the reports we had on file. I couldn't find one that had been written off for this reason. I dug back into my own flying experience and talked to a dozen pilots. All of us had momentarily been startled by a reflection on the aircraft's canopy or wing, but in a second or two it had been obvious that it was a reflection. Mantell chased the object for at least 15 to 20 minutes, and it is inconceivable that he wouldn't realize in that length of time that he was chasing a reflection. About the only theory left to check was that the object might have been one of the big 100-foot diameter skyhook balloons. I rechecked the descriptions of the UFO made by the people in the tower. The first man to sight the object called it a parachute. Others said ice cream cone, round, etc. All of these descriptions fit a balloon. Buried deep in the file were two more references to balloons that I had previously missed. Not long after the object had disappeared from view at Godman Air Force Base, a man from Madisonville, Kentucky called Flight Services in Dayton. He had seen an object traveling southeast. He had looked at it through a telescope, and it was a balloon. At 4:45, an astronomer living north of Nashville, Tennessee, called in. He had also seen a UFO,